need to work together to make sure that we actually derive the maximum benefit that this new model offers.
Thank you. So back to the floor. Any? Yes, we have a.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on this dialogue over the UN Declaration. Under Article 42 of the Declaration, which was passed by the UN General Assembly, there were only 4 countries that opposed, and all 4 have since withdrawn. But it's a General Assembly decision that has passed by the United Nations, so who abstained or did not isn't so relevant anymore. Article 42 says that the Declaration applies to specialized agencies of the UN, of which the World Bank is one, and it applies under 2 different provisions of the UN Charter. And so I'm a little confused why it would be seen as something that's optional for the bank. Moreover, tying that to the concerns about discretion to the borrower, when we look specifically at the Indigenous Peoples Policy, and it allows for the alternative approach, which I know there have been plenty of concerns already raised about allowing the borrower to choose alternatives for the Indigenous Peoples Policy. If Indigenous peoples are not recognized, and if the discretion is to the borrower, then there's concern, for example, that resettlement policy, cultural heritage, and some of the other provisions, other policies, they don't have any reference to FPIC, for example, which we know that under UN DRIP and international human rights treaties that there are some explicit concerns there, and without, if you don't have the Indigenous Peoples provision applying, what's to stop consent versus consultation being the standard in that context under the resettlement policy, for example. So I'm curious how the alternative approach would apply in that context. Thank you.
Yeah, should we take?
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Martin Sneary. I'm with IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. I was very heartened in the opening remarks and the opening presentations that the text is not yet set in stone, and there is a strong desire to move to a greater level of harmonisation between the approaches taken by the respective financial institutions. As such, we do have a slight concern that the language and the approach that's presented in ESS 6 diverges quite considerably from the approach that was well established in Performance Standard 6 of the International Finance Corporation. And whilst there are merits in the new approach that's been advocated, we do wonder whether it's almost a step too far that doesn't form a nice bridge between what has been achieved with IFC's Performance Standard 6 and indeed has been picked up and adopted by a broad set of other financial institutions, including the EPFIs and the OECD export credit agencies, whether there might be an opportunity to reflect and make a stronger convergence in the approach, because I think rather than having revolution, there may be an opportunity to have evolution that brings the disparate parts of the bank, the public sector and the private sector lending, their approaches closer together. And then maybe on a slightly longer timeline, we could look at some slightly more fundamental review of some of the approaches that we're taking on biodiversity, accepting that we think the approaches that have been made to date have been quite commendable and have a lot of merit to them. So something to reflect upon in the ongoing deliberations around the structure and language that sits in the SS6 in particular. Thank you.
Should we respond to those two? So Charles, and then maybe.
Again, we, as Mark said before, we have not completed drafting of a number of relevant instruments to our framework. So we are certainly aware of the declaration. Let me point out also that a similar argument was made concerning the declaration before the Climate Change Convention and the Convention on Biological Diversity, and there as well, they decided that they would simply take it into account. And I think that's something that we are certainly willing to do. But by saying that they take it into account, they reaffirm the fact that as a matter of international law, a declaration is not legally binding. So I think we're happy to discuss that further, but that's our understanding about how to go forward with that.
I just want to say a few words about the alternative approach clause and how it originated. We had a meeting with some indigenous peoples leaders in New York a few weeks ago at the UN Congress, and we talked about this. And I started off by saying that I know that you'll be happy with the current draft, in that it makes advances over the existing operational policy, because we're now having wording on free prior informed consent, which you asked for, that we are addressing. We have words on how to deal with people who wish to remain in voluntary isolation, which you asked for. And also we have wording recognizing that pastoralists and lifestyles can fall into the definition of indigenous peoples, which you asked for. And then I said, I know there's something in the draft that you didn't ask for and that many of you are not happy with, which is the alternative approach language. And let's just reflect a little bit about how that's come about. As we mentioned earlier on, we're a community. The World Bank is a community of 188 shareholders, countries. Many of them have very, very different geographies, socioeconomic backgrounds, cultures, values. And what we heard from a large number of countries, particularly on the African continent, is that they don't like the indigenous peoples policy. They think the use of the term indigenous is inappropriate, to say the least, and some find it offensive. And we also heard from some countries that say that indigenous peoples are well recognized within their constitution, some Latin American countries, and again that it would be inappropriate to use the term indigenous peoples and have a policy in such areas. So we were faced with a situation where we had quite a polar view amongst shareholders. And so we tried to address the concerns by coming up with this alternative approach language that would allow us to protect and safeguard indigenous peoples in situations where some countries don't want to or don't like the use of the term indigenous peoples. And we narrowed that down into two areas. Firstly, where use of the term or use of the policy could be seen as divisive and quote unquote favoring one group over another within mixed communities, and that it might incite violence, racial tension, and so on. That was one area. And I can say that a number of African ministers of finance expressed that concern very, very clearly to me when I was in the Khartoum meeting of African finance ministers a few weeks ago. And then the second area, as I mentioned, is the area where, according to national constitutions, using this alternative approach, using the indigenous peoples policy is seen as inappropriate vis-à-vis the constitution. Now, what does this mean if we use an alternative approach? What it means is the country does not have the choice on its own to decide or not to use the indigenous peoples standard going forward. It's not their decision alone. The decision is based on the following process. Firstly, the country would have to propose to the bank that the indigenous peoples standard not be used, citing reasons for that. The bank would then engage social and anthropological experts, indigenous peoples experts, to look into the particular circumstances, to discuss this issue with the indigenous peoples and obtain their views. This would be written up, disclosed in the public domain, and ultimately it would be considered by the board. And the board would decide whether or not a particular country could use the alternative approach or not. So this is, I must emphasize, this is not countries deciding this. This is the board ultimately deciding this. Now, we've heard a lot of concern about this clause, and I have to say, from our own staff, as well as from CSOs and indigenous peoples leaders and the ILO and so on. But it was important to at least put this wording in, which reflected the concerns of a large number of our shareholding countries. and to have this debate now that there is a specific wording and a specific concept on the table to discuss, rather than, as I mentioned, an abstract discussion that we were having in the first round of global consultations. So the fate of this clause within the standard is not up for me, or Stefan, or Kyle, or anyone else to decide. It's up for the board to decide. And the board will take a view based on the input that they have from stakeholders, whoever they may be and in what form they are around the globe. Thanks.
And do you want to respond to the comment on ESS 6? Oh.
Yes, in terms of ESS 6, we were trying to take the commitments in the existing operational policies on forests and natural habitats and bring them together without losing any of the commitments, but also take on board some of the philosophy and approach of PS6 and PR6 in the case of EBRD and others. We're trying to put something together. Clearly, we're not fully there yet. We've heard that from a number of people. And we are having, in a week or so, a thematic meeting, which I think you're coming to discuss this issue. So this is work in progress. As we've said several times today, these things are not cast in stone. We're here to listen how we can improve the drafts based on ongoing discussions.
Maybe just one word on the point Mohammed raised on equity, which we share very much. As you know, the bank has been at the forefront of research on poverty reduction and has been a leading force in arguing that a more prosperous society requires also a more equitable distribution of income. So that's not new. I think what's important here is there's two aspects. One is the bank's embracing of goals that focus on poverty reduction and sharing of prosperity, which is directly addressed at equity. And secondly, I think the point that's been made before but bears reiteration, namely that safeguards are ultimately about protecting people from potentially adverse impacts of investment projects. The bank's engagement on income distribution, on poverty reduction, goes way beyond that. We engage with a variety of instruments, including our policy dialogue, our knowledge sharing, our engagement on capacity building, using our variety of instruments. Investment projects are only really one part of that. And we try to address the bank's goals through the variety of instruments that are at our disposal to support our clients in the quest for a more prosperous and more equitable society.
Okay, back to the floor. Any further questions or observations? Oh, Mohammed again.
Sorry. I mean, I'm trying to take advantage of this just to make things clearer and for both sides. The issue of country framework, it's getting clearer. However, there is a delicate part, which is when deciding on which framework we want to use, whether the World Bank framework or the country framework, or the country system. My understanding is board members at the bank are usually representing the governments, their governments, and the countries they are also representing. The governments in developing countries in the global south are still having significant problem in their communication with grassroots people. So, thus, the ED of any country would fit into that category of representing government's perspective, which does not necessarily reflect grassroots. This is the logic that I'm understanding. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope so. Now, how do you make sure that when a country proposes a project, the grassroots perspective is taken into consideration? What if this government does not, or it's not taking into consideration grassroots perspective? What is the role of the World Bank in terms of ensuring that there is a sort of space reserved for a bottom-up approach. Thank you.
Thanks. Do you want to respond? Anne, can you give the mic here?
My name is Rafael Hernandez. I am in the chair that represents Mexico, Central America, Venezuela, and Spain. And I would like to refer to what Mohammed just said. I think that he is partially correct when he says that we here represent the interests of our countries. However, perhaps he is omitting a very important responsibility that we all have at the board, and that is that we are protecting the interests of the institution as well. I can speak from my experience that we have had an open door for all different kinds of constituencies that have points of view that differ from what the government might be saying. And I can assure him that in the 5 years that I have been in the chair, and you can check, we had a very interesting discussion 2 days ago with a group of CSOs from North Mexico, Central America, and South America, where these issues that we're hearing here today were presented to us. And we assured them, as we always have, that we have a very intense dialogue with the governors that are here and with the different ministers that visit us, that there are things that perhaps need to be taken into consideration, and that even if we are representatives of that country, when it comes to the discussion, we tell them this is something that the institution as a whole is embracing, and we will be an outlier if we just look the other way. So I can assure you, Mohammed, that we have a double responsibility, and the responsibility of the welfare of the institution is as high, if not higher, of what we can do for hundreds.
Thank you. So maybe, okay, Mark.
You asked some questions also, Mohammed, about whether stakeholders, the grassroots, would be able to express an view. Well, yes, they would. If we are proposing to use elements of a country's framework, that would be disclosed in the bank's project documentation in the PAD, and so stakeholders would have the opportunity to comment on whether or not we should, in their view, use elements of a country framework. And I won't name countries here, but I have very direct experience of CSOs feeding back to financial institutions, MDBs, and saying, we hear that you're proposing to use X, Y of a country framework somewhere, and we don't think it's appropriate, and here's why. And they had valid concerns, and they were listened to. So it is important to listen to grassroots.
The thing is, the government is playing like sort of a midway, the bank and the grassroots. This is mostly what's happening. I'm sorry. So I'm going to repeat. So the governments usually play the sort of a midway entity between the World Bank and grassroots. There is a rare, it's not as frequently as we wish that the bank would have a better or constant communication with grassroots. Usually this is happening through governments. The problem is governments sometimes fail to fulfill this principle. So how do you make sure, and what is the role you're going to play in order to make sure that governments, when proposing a government, they are taking into consideration an inclusive approach with their grassroots or civil society?
Mohammed, I think it's spelled out in the bank's policy that it's our responsibility to carry out due diligence to be sure that the governments do things even if they're not comfortable doing it. So it's our responsibility to make sure that the stakeholder engagement plan is done, and it's our responsibility to be sure that what we've embedded, what we think are key human rights principles that we've embedded in our policies, meaningful consultation, and effective public participation, are part of that process. If that doesn't take place because the government doesn't feel like doing it, and we haven't insisted on it, then we've failed in our due diligence responsibilities, and we're accountable for that. But I think, that's the way to look at the issue that you're raising. Meaningful consultation, effective public participation are an essential requirement for us to go forward with bank project financing.
Okay, let me ask, does anyone other than Mohammed have any intervention?
No, carry on.
Because if not, if everybody has expressed whatever they had, then maybe I'll just turn to my colleague Anne to just give a brief overview of the consultation process going forward, and then we could ask perhaps Stefan to wind up on behalf of the panel.
Hi, my name is Anne-Katrine Arnold. I'm working on the consultations for the Safeguard review. So I've heard a lot today about how not to do my job. Just to give you a brief idea of where we're going from here. So we are starting the country consultations in earnest at the end of this month. We've been in Georgia at the end of September. That was the kind of outlier, but we are going to start a systematic effort at the end of this month. We have Egypt, for instance, we have Turkey, for instance, and a range of other countries, and you can find the list of countries on our website. There's a document that lists the countries and the dates if they are confirmed, and then there's also a category called meetings on the website where you can see the meetings where participants have been invited, and so these are, these meetings are solid. We have the location for it, we have the time for it. What I would ask anyone who's interested in participating in meetings to send an email through the website to safeguardconsult@worldbank.org. The email is on the website. That's how we can make sure that you are, if you want to participate, that you are getting an invitation. We just need to know about that. We heard about Georgia, there was a problem, but the best way to make us know that you want to participate is to go through the website. Then we can personally make sure that you will be invited. We have a range of other activities planned. For instance, we're doing expert focus groups, a little similar to what we did in the first round of consultation. There will be one on labor. I think there's one on biodiversity later this month. And then there also will be one on vulnerable groups. And we're thinking as we go ahead, as we have a little more time now, that the President promised to extend the consultation phase, what we can add to that. We have meetings with indigenous peoples. I believe there are 7 meetings planned at the moment, where we're going to indigenous peoples hubs in the different regions, and going to have a dedicated dialogue with them there to specifically discuss their concerns, also specifically with regard to the proposed indigenous peoples standard and the alternative approach that was talked about. What we're also thinking about doing is a number of completely public global meetings online. That is something that we're still thinking about. We can do that through our consultation hub at the World Bank, where we basically invite whoever would be interested to discuss the safeguards reform with us. If you go to our website, there's quite a wide range of communication channels that you can use. You can leave just a comment, which will be published on the consultation website so that everybody can see what you think. You can send us a document, a statement, which we will also publish if you allow us to. So there are quite a few interactive methods that you can use on the consultation hub. But what's really important that if you see a shortcoming in the consultation process, if you think we can do better, please email us. Please let us know about this. But because a lot of these things are things that we can fix, that we can work on and that we can better. So that's definitely something. Just work with us on that, and so we get a good consultation process going here.
Thanks, Anne. So maybe, Stefan, would you like to just
let me just really close by thanking all of you for patiently sitting here, also for taking the opportunity to raise concerns, raise issues, listen to others, and bring important issues to our attention. As those of you who've been in this discussion for a while can attest, this is a very complex area. There isn't really a right or wrong. We have seen today a glimpse of the values, of the emotions, of the importance attached to particular issues. In this process, of course, we are exposed to a number of different opinions, and it's really a privilege to be able to help steer this process through a very difficult environment where people have long-held views, very high expectations of the bank, which we take very seriously. So I think it's a big obligation for us as a team, for our colleagues, to really respect all the views that we hear. And let me just reiterate really our intention to do a very good job in reflecting those views. At the end of the process, we will present a revised draft that hopefully reflects some of the inputs that we've received, that will ultimately be adopted by the board. We cannot guarantee that everybody will be happy with this. This is not a process where we can have full consensus. We also need to clarify that. But we really want to hear from everybody, and we want to really appreciate this period that we're in the consultation period, to get very specific inputs, to hear anything we may have left out, anything we could have strengthened, any areas where we didn't get the language right, any areas where you have particular points that you think need to be addressed, and we welcome that in all forms, whether it's verbally, whether it's in these consultation meetings, whether it's through online discussions, or whether it's through specific inputs that you're sending us. And we carefully look at all of those. So I'd just like to thank you and reiterate that these are complex areas that will require a lot of discussions, and we are open for hearing views on this. So thank you very much for taking the time to look at this and stay with us in this process. I think there's...
Thank you, everybody.